But now John put his hand into his pocket, brought out a whistle, and blew upon it several modulated blasts that rang far across the heated air. I could not tell, of course, the meaning of the signal, but it instantly awoke my fears. More men would be coming, and might be discovered. They had already slain two of the honest people. After Tom and Ellen, might not I come next? Instantly I began to extricate myself and crawled back again, with what speed and silence I could manage, to the more open portion of the wood. As I did so, I could hear hails coming and going between the old buccaneer and his comrades, and this sound of danger lent me wings. As soon as I was clear of the thicket, I ran as I never ran before, scarce minding the direction of my flight, so long as it led me from my murderers. And as I ran, fear grew and grew upon me until it turned into a kind of frenzy. Indeed, could anyone be more entirely lost than I? When the gun fired, how should I dare to go down onto the boats among those fiends, still smoking from the crime? Would not the first of them who saw me wring my neck like a snake's? Would not my absence itself be evidence to them of my alarm, and therefore of my fatal knowledge? It was all over, I thought. Goodbye to Hispaniola, goodbye to the squire, the doctor, and the captain. There was nothing left for me but death by starvation, or death by the hands of the mutineers. All this while, as I say, I was still running, and without taking any notice, I had drawn near to the foot of the little hill, with two peaks, and had got into a part of the island where the live oaks grew more wildly apart and seemed more like forest trees in their bearing and dimensions. Mingled with these were a few scattered pines, some 50, some near 70 feet high. The air, too, smelled more freshly than the downside of the marsh, and here a fresh alarm brought me to a standstill with a thumping heart. 15. The men of the island. From the side of the hill, which was here steep and stony, a spout of gravel was dislodged and fell rattling and bounding through the trees. My eyes turned instinctively in that direction, and I saw a figure leap with great rapidity behind the trunk of a tree. What it was, whether bear or man or monkey, I could in no wise tell. It seemed dark and shaggy. More I knew not, but the terror of this new apparition brought me to a stand. I was now, it seemed cut off upon both sides. Behind me the murderers, before me this lurking nondescript, and immediately I began to prefer the dangers that I knew to those that I knew not. Silver himself appeared less terrible in contrast with this creature of the woods, and I turned on my heel and, looking sharply behind me over my shoulder, began to retrace my steps in the direction of the boats. Instantly the figure reappeared, and making a wide circuit, began to head me off. I was tired at any rate, but had I been as fresh as I rose, I could see it was in vain for me to contend in speed with such an adversary. From trunk to trunk, the creature flitted like a deer, running man-like in two legs, but unlike any man that I had ever seen, stooping almost double as it ran. Yet a man it was. I could no longer be in doubt about that. I began to recall what I had heard of cannibals. I was within ace of calling for help, but the mere fact that it was a man, however wild, had somewhat reassured me, and my fear of Silver began to revive in proportion. I stood still, therefore, and cast about for some method of escape, and as I was so thinking, the recollection of my pistol flashed into my mind. As soon as I remembered I was not defenseless, courage glowed again in my heart, and I set my face resolutely for this man of the island and walked briskly towards him. He was concealed by this time behind another tree trunk, but he must have been watching me closely, for as soon as I began to move in his direction, he reappeared and stood a step to meet me. Then he hesitated, drew back, came forward again, and at last, to my wonder and confusion, threw himself to his knees and held out his clasped hand in supplication. At that, I once more stopped. "Who are you?" I asked. "Bengan," he answered, and his voice sounded hoarse and awkward, like a rusty lock. "I'm poor Bengan, I am, and I haven't spoken with a Christian these 3 years." I could see that he was a white man like myself, and that his features were even pleasing. His skin, wherever it was exposed, was burned by the sun. Even his lips were black, and his fair eye looked quite startling in so dark a face. Of all the beggar men that I'd seen or fancied, he was the chief for raggedness. He was clothed with tatters of old ship canvas and old sea cloth, and this extraordinary patchwork was all held together by a system of the most various and incongruous fastenings, brass buttons, bits of stick, and loops of tarry gaskin. About his waist he wore an old brass buckled leather belt, which was the one thing solid in his whole accoutrement. 3 years, I cried. "Were you shipwrecked?" "Nay, mate," he said, "marooned." I had heard the word, and I knew it stood for a horrible kind of punishment, common enough among the buccaneers, in which the offender is put ashore with a little powder and shot and left behind on some desolate and distant island. "Marooned 3 years ago," he continued, "and lived on goats since then, and berries and oysters. Wherever a man is, says I, a man can do for himself. But, mate, my heart is sore for Christian diet. You mightn't happen to have a piece of cheese about you now, no? Well, many's the long night I've dreamed of cheese, toasted mostly, and woke up again, and here I were. If ever I can get aboard again," said I, "you shall have cheese by the stone." All this time he had been feeling the stuff of my jacket, smoothing my hands, looking at my boots, and generally, in the intervals of the speech, showing a childish pleasure in the presence of a fellow creature. But at my last words he perked into a kind of startled slyness. "If ever you can get aboard again, says you," he repeated. "Why, now, what's to hinder you?" "Not you, I know," was my reply. "And right you was," he cried. "Now you, what do you call yourself, mate?" "Jim," I told him. Jim, says he, quite pleased apparently. "Well now, Jim, I've lived that rough as you'd be ashamed to hear of. Now, for instance, you wouldn't think I had a pious mother to look at me?" he asked. "Why not?" "Why, no, not in particular," I answered. "Well then," said he, "but I had remarkable pious, and I was a civil, pious boy, and could rattle off my catechism that fast that you couldn't tell one word from another. And here's what it came to, Jim." And it began to chuck farther on the blessed gravestones. That's what it began with, but it went further than that. And so my mother told me that predicted the whole. She did, the pious woman. But it were Providence that put me here. I've thought it all out in this here lonely island, and I'm back on piety. You don't catch me tasting rum so much, but just a thimbleful for luck. Of course, the first chance I have, I'm bound to be good, and I see the way too. And Jim, looking all around him and lowering his voice to a whisper, "I'm rich." I now felt sure that the poor fellow had gone crazy in his solitude, and I suppose I must have shown the feeling on my face, for he repeated the statement hotly. Rich, rich, I say, and I tell you what, I'll make a man of you, Jim. Ah, Jim, you'll bless your stars, you will. You was the first that found me. And at this, there came suddenly a lowering shadow over his face. He tightened his grasp upon my hand and raised a forefinger threatening before my eyes. Now, Jim, you tell me true. That ain't Flint's ship, he asked. At this, I had a happy inspiration. I began to believe that I found an ally, and I answered him at once. It's not Flint's ship, and Flint is dead. But I'll tell you true, as you ask me. There are some of Flint's hands aboard, worse luck for the rest of us. Not a man with one leg, he gasped. Silver, I asked. Ah, Silver, says he. There were his name. That's the cook and the ringleader too. He was still holding by my wrist, and at that he gave me quite a ring. If you was sent by Lon Jong, he said, I'm as good as pork, and I know it. But where was you, do you suppose? I had made my mind up in a moment, and by a way of answer told him the whole story of our voyage and the predicament in which we found ourselves. He heard me with the keenest interest, and when I had done, he patted me on the head. You're a good lad, Jim, he said, and you're all in a clove hitch, ain't you? Well, you just put your trust in Ben Gunn. Ben Gunn's the man to do it. Would you think it likely now that your squire would prove a liberal-minded one in case of help? Him